Three of the best FPS games to come out in the 90s were Duke Nukem 3D, Shadow Warrior, and Blood. All three games used the build engine, and all three games were homages to different genres. Duke Nukem 3D was all about the cheesy action movies, Shadow Warrior was a homage to martial arts films, and Blood was all about the horror genre. What these three had in common though was that they were some of the tightest, most solid shooting you would ever see on the build engine, and I've often referred to them as the holy trifecta of build engine games, because nothing else on the build engine really came all that close to capturing just how much fun these three were to play. Caleb is the anti-hero for Blood, and he's one of the best of the old school FPS protagonists. He's just a super pissed off badass on a mission to hunt down and kill everyone who did him wrong, and you've really got to admire someone who's got such a singular motive.
Rest in pieces.
However, Blood's a game that never quite got the same attention that Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior got. Duke Nukem of course got the eventual Duke Nukem Forever, but before that there was a spin-off platformer called the Manhattan Project, as well as a few other titles for the consoles. Shadow Warrior was rebooted in 2013 by Flying Wild Hog, and they followed that up with the sequel in 2016. Not to mention both Duke Nukem and Shadow Warrior also got their own remastered versions as well. Duke had the Megaton Edition and the World Tour Edition, and Shadow Warrior had Classic Redux. Meanwhile, Blood just kind of skulked around in the shadows like that weird creepy uncle at a family gathering that people try not to make eye contact with. Getting your hands bloody, as the game's original marketing campaign would put it, hasn't really ever been all that hard. In fact, it's been available on Steam and goodoldgames.com for like years now. The issue is that this version runs in DOSBox emulation, which isn't terrible, but it can often require a lot of buggering around until you get it working properly. I mean, for instance, I can't even play the game without downloading a fix that prevents the heads-up display from flickering all the time. Aside from that, the DOSBox version also uses the CD soundtrack by default instead of the MIDI version, which I think is far superior. And the volume for the CD music is so goddamn loud that I'd wager most folks would want to turn it down, if not completely off, as soon as you start playing. Even doing something that simple requires editing DOSBox configuration files. Similarly, with the graphics mode you choose, you're going to run into a few bugs here and there with rendering issues, something that again takes a bit of playing around with the config files to fix. I mean, it's not like you need to be some kind of computer whiz to fix all this stuff, but it's kind of far from double clicking an exe and just having everything working properly from the get-go. The only other options if you're not going to play it through DOSBox is one of the many source ports, but even then they're not really proper source ports because the source code for Blood has still never been released. So what people have tried to do, I guess, is reverse engineer Blood using other source ports like eJuke32 as a basis and trying to recreate the original code as best they can. And there's a whole heap of these out there, some finished, some still in development, some good and others not so much. Blood Reborn, for instance, is beyond embarrassing. It looks like a crappy pirated port of a Game Boy Advance version of Blood or something, and I genuinely can't believe that someone made this with a straight face. I mean, just look at it. Then there's a few other ones that don't even work at all and haven't been updated in years, making them even more redundant. Most of the other so-called recreations are still in development, which is where they'll hopefully stay. I mean, look, nothing against the people working on them, but most of these just look really bad. And they epitomise the old saying, just because you can, doesn't mean you should. One of the better ones is the recreation of the entire game with the Doom engine, which is called Z-Blood, which is actually really admirable. It's not really meant for a first-time playthrough, but it is impressive in the way that they've managed to pull off the whole thing in the limited Doom engine. And I did a video on this one a while back too, so if you want to hear me talk about it in any great detail, well, go watch that video. For a long time it was argued that the best of these was one called Blood CM, but I have to say, I just never thought Blood CM was any good. I've probably played the original game for hundreds of hours. It's easily the build engine FPS game I've played the most, and I know Blood like the back of my ass. And Blood CM just always felt off. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what's not right, but if you spend any decent amount of time with Blood, you'd probably agree that it just doesn't feel the same. I think one of the issues is the movement controls and also the way certain weapons handle. The dynamite, for instance, just feels wrong and the damage is kind of inconsistent. Usually a well-thrown dynamite bundle can one-shot the butchers, but at times in Blood CM it takes 2 or even 3 of these. And the removal of the auto-aim messes with the way certain weapons feel and handle. Speaking of auto-aim, the flare gun's auto-aim feels pretty bad too. Like, normally this thing kind of snaps to the nearest enemy, but in Blood CM it's really kind of temperamental. And it just seems at times it goes right through enemies completely. Probably the biggest issue is how the Tesla gun behaves. Now, this one again is hard to pinpoint, but it feels like the firing rate is quicker, but the stun animation when hitting enemies is longer, without necessarily doing any more damage. You know what, they're not game-breaking problems by any means, but they're just really quite different to the original game in some pretty fundamental ways. Probably because it's running off the eJuke source port, and it's honestly to the point that I'd recommend someone just play the DOSBox emulation than this. However, Sunny Jim, all hope is not lost, and I've left the best to last, because finally we got Blood Gdx, which I think is hands down the best of the so-called source ports that are out there. And funnily enough, it was also made by the same guy who worked on Blood CM. I mean, talk about turning that lump of coal into a diamond. This is the one to me that feels the most like the original game. I mean, I noticed a few issues with the splash damage at times, but almost across the board it feels like the original in every single way. With the bonus of course being that it works perfectly in widescreen, it runs at a smooth frame rate, and it doesn't crash or have any glaring bugs or glitches. In fact, if someone had told me that it was an actual proper source port, I probably would have believed them. What are the downsides to Blood Gdx? Well, unlike a lot of the other recreations, you actually need to own the original game, as Blood Gdx needs the group files to run properly, but that's not a huge issue anyway. What is an issue though is that this version doesn't play the cinematics, which aren't exactly necessary to understand what's going on, but they do add an element of immersion into the game world. Considering I think most folks using Blood Gdx will probably have finished Blood already and know the basic plot, it's not a huge problem, but people playing it for the first time might want to look the cinematics up on YouTube or something. The fact that it runs in Java might be a bit of a turn off to some people too, but it's kind of a case of beggars can't be choosers, and considering the quality or lack thereof of most of the other recreations, this thing is a shining beacon in what's otherwise been a murky, dimly lit swamp of disappointment. If you want to play Blood in high resolution with a solid frame rate from the get-go, well, this is the one to go with. So finally, what's happening with the future of Blood? Well, fans have been asking for a sequel for years, and we've been clamoring for a proper remaster for years as well. The issue is the licensing surrounding the whole thing and the bullshit that's been going on with releasing the source code. Stephen Waite, the dude who voiced Caleb, has expressed his interest in doing a new game too, and to be honest, you can't do it without him. His voice acting is the heart and soul of the game and a part of what makes Caleb such a likeable protagonist.
Fresh victims for the ever-growing army of the undead.
The way he chucks in a quick little one-liner, or comments dryly on something occurring, is part of his charm, due to his comical over-the-top screaming when he's lit on fire. I know that Kaiser, the guy who worked on Power Slave EX and the recent Turok 2, has also been working on a similar update titled Blood EX, but I have no idea what the status of it is, and if it's anything like what happened to Power Slave EX, well, it's probably been put on hold indefinitely. At the end of the day, I'd still say try and get the DOSBox version working, as it is the most authentic, but as a headache-free alternative, at the moment, Blood Gdx is as good as it's gonna get. At least until the day when they finally release the source code, or through some kind of black magic, the game is allowed a proper remaster. But who knows if that day's ever gonna come.